Three completely separate pressure points are converging on Iran at the exact same moment, and each one, on its own, would already be a serious problem for any government to manage, let alone a government already stretched thin by months of continuous warfare on multiple fronts. Put together, they're raising a question that would have sounded almost unthinkable a couple of years ago. Is the Islamic Republic of Iran, as a functioning unified state, actually starting to come apart at the seams? An armed uprising is spreading through Kurdish regions in the northwest, drawing on decades of unresolved grievance and a newly unified political leadership. The country's nuclear program has become an almost total black box, with international inspectors unable to say with any confidence where hundreds of kilograms of near-weapons-grade uranium actually are. And the largest American military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq is sitting right on Iran's doorstep, tied directly to a war that's already been grinding on for months. Let's walk through each of these three threads carefully, because understanding how they actually connect to each other tells you a lot more about where this is all heading than looking at any single one of them in isolation. It's worth being clear from the outset that answering this question honestly requires resisting the pull toward either extreme, the temptation to declare collapse imminent based on dramatic footage and bold statements, and the equally tempting instinct to dismiss all of it as just another round of exaggerated wartime coverage that will fade once the news cycle moves on. The reality, as usual, sits somewhere in the more complicated middle ground, and getting there requires actually working through what's verifiably happening on each of these three fronts individually before trying to assess what their combination actually adds up to. And let's start with where all of this really began, because the current moment didn't come out of nowhere. Toward the end of 2025, Iran experienced a major wave of popular unrest, triggered by a familiar combination of economic hardship and long-simmering political grievances. What started largely in Tehran's bazaar districts rapidly spread outward, eventually reaching hundreds of cities across the country, including deep into Iran's northwestern Kurdish regions, an area Kurds themselves refer to as Rojhelat. The Iranian government responded the way it typically does when faced with this kind of unrest, deploying its usual playbook of repressive policing, mass arrests, and internet blackouts, specifically designed to cut off protesters from each other and from the outside world. In most of the country, that strategy worked reasonably well at suppressing the initial wave of demonstrations, with security forces gradually wearing down the protests in Tehran and other major cities. But something different happened in the Kurdish regions. Rather than fading out under pressure, the movement there kept its momentum going, organizing through a sophisticated combination of general strikes and what researchers monitoring the situation from Iraqi Kurdistan have described as satellite-linked underground cells, allowing organizers to coordinate even after the government cut off conventional internet access. It's worth understanding that Kurdish aspirations for greater autonomy or outright independence inside Iran aren't a new phenomenon born out of this current crisis. The struggle traces back more than a century through tribal uprisings and the gradual rise of organized Kurdish nationalism, reaching one of its most significant historical moments in 1946, when a Kurdish nationalist leader briefly declared an independent Republic of Kurdistan centered around the city of Mahabad, an entity that survived less than a year before Iranian central government forces moved back in and dismantled it. That history matters because it shapes how both sides currently understand the stakes involved. For Kurdish nationalists, the current moment represents another chapter in a very long struggle that has repeatedly seen brief windows of opportunity open and then close again once the broader geopolitical circumstances shifted. For Iran's central government, that same history serves as a constant reminder of exactly why Kurdish regions have historically received such disproportionate security attention and such a heavy, sustained military and intelligence presence relative to their population size, a pattern that's clearly repeating itself again in how forcefully Tehran has responded to this latest round of organizing. That resilience matters enormously because it set the stage for something that hadn't really existed in quite this form before. A genuinely unified political coalition representing the major Kurdish opposition parties operating both inside and outside Iran. In early January of 2026, several of these parties met under the auspices of a dialogue center to coordinate a joint response to the unfolding unrest, and that meeting eventually produced a formal alliance called the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. This coalition brought together groups with names like the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, and several other factions that had, for years, operated somewhat independently of each other, sometimes with real historical tension between them. Uniting under a single political umbrella represented a significant shift, and it gave the broader Kurdish opposition movement a coherence it had lacked in previous decades of scattered, less coordinated resistance. The most striking moment in this whole process came on March the 2nd of 2026, when the newly formed coalition issued its very first joint statement, and the content of that statement was genuinely remarkable. Rather than simply condemning the government or calling for more protests, the coalition directly addressed Iran's own armed forces stationed in Kurdish areas, urging soldiers and security personnel to separate themselves from what the statement called the remnants of the Islamic Republic. That's an extraordinary thing for an opposition coalition to say publicly, essentially inviting a portion of the regime's own military apparatus to defect, rather than continue enforcing the government's authority in Kurdish territory. The statement also called on the broader Kurdish population to remain vigilant, to stay coordinated, and to align their political actions with guidance from the alliance going forward, signaling an intention to move beyond loosely organized street protests towards something more structured and more explicitly political in nature. It's worth putting some real numbers next to just how far this unrest actually spread and how seriously the government responded to it, because the scale involved is genuinely significant. As the protest wave continued through late 2025 and into early 2026, additional provinces, including Ilam and Malakshari, joined the movement, extending organized resistance across essentially the entirety of Iranian Kurdistan. Government repression gradually wore down the initial demonstrations, concentrated in Tehran's bazaar districts, prompting security forces to redirect their attention specifically toward the western cities of Ilam and Kermanshah in an effort to stamp out what remained of the broader movement. That redirected pressure, rather than ending the unrest, instead provoked a wave of solidarity actions across other Kurdish cities, with new rounds of demonstrations reigniting almost as quickly as previous ones were suppressed. Casualty figures from this period remain genuinely contested, with Kurdish monitoring organizations reporting a smaller number of deaths during specific incidents than Iranian government sources acknowledge, a discrepancy that's fairly typical in situations like this where independent verification remains extremely difficult given the government's tight control over information flowing out of the region. Iran's response to this growing coordination was swift and in some respects predictable, given the regime's history of dealing with Kurdish unrest. As the broader war with the United States and Israel intensified, Iranian forces and allied militia groups launched a sustained campaign of strikes specifically targeting Iranian Kurdish opposition parties based across the border in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where several of these groups have maintained bases and political offices for years, sometimes decades. According to monitoring groups tracking the situation, close to 200 separate attacks have hit Kurdish areas of Iraq since the broader war began, a staggering number that reflects just how seriously Tehran views the Kurdish opposition as a genuine threat, rather than a marginal nuisance. These strikes have involved ballistic missiles, Shahed-type drones, and reportedly even aging fighter aircraft from Iran's own air force, prompting the Kurdistan region's own defenses, along with coalition partners, including American, British, French, and Italian forces stationed there, to respond using Patriot missile batteries and other short-range air defense systems to try to intercept incoming threats. This is where the story gets genuinely complicated, though, and where a lot of the more sensational framing around a Kurdish uprising tends to gloss over an important nuance. While Iranian Kurdish opposition parties based in Iraq have publicly voiced support for Kurdish self-determination inside Iran and have engaged in limited cross-border operations, the actual leadership of Iraq's own semi-autonomous Kurdistan region has gone out of its way to distance itself from any suggestion that it's directly orchestrating or leading an uprising inside Iran. In one particularly candid interview, the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq's Kurdistan region described his government's position in stark terms, explaining that officials there are desperately trying to avoid being dragged into this broader fight. That reluctance makes complete sense once you understand what's actually at stake for Iraqi Kurds specifically. The Kurdistan region of Iraq has spent decades carefully building a level of autonomy, economic development, and relative stability that stands in sharp contrast to the chaos experienced by much of the rest of Iraq. And getting pulled into a direct confrontation with Iran, a much larger and more powerful neighbor that's already demonstrated a willingness to strike targets inside Iraqi Kurdish territory, threatens to undo exactly those hard-won gains. Ordinary residents in cities like Sulaymaniyah have expressed genuine anxiety that this wider regional war could unravel decades of progress almost overnight, which is a very different emotional register than the triumphant framing of an unstoppable uprising that sometimes shows up in more sensational coverage of this story. There's also a political dimension worth understanding here, because outside actors have clearly recognized the strategic value of Kurdish discontent inside Iran, even if they're being careful about how openly they engage with it. Reports have indicated that President Trump held direct contact with Mustafa Hijri, the leader of the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, one of the most established Kurdish opposition parties with a long history of armed resistance against the Iranian government going back decades. That kind of high-level engagement, even if described in relatively cautious diplomatic terms, signals that Washington sees genuine strategic value in Kurdish opposition movements as a potential pressure point against Tehran, separate from the direct military campaign already underway. At the same time, positions among different Kurdish factions inside Iran itself have not been entirely unified, with some groups more cautious about openly aligning with American or Israeli interests, wary of the accusation that they're simply serving as proxies for foreign powers rather than pursuing a genuinely independent Kurdish political agenda. That kind of internal disagreement is worth keeping in mind because it complicates any simple narrative suggesting Iran's Kurdish population is moving as a single, unified bloc toward open rebellion. It's also worth widening the lens slightly beyond just the Kurdish regions, because Iran's Kurdish population isn't the only ethnic minority community with a long history of grievances against the central government in Tehran. Iran is home to a genuinely diverse patchwork of ethnic and linguistic minorities, including significant Balakh and Azeri populations, each concentrated in their own historically distinct regions along different stretches of the country's borders, and each with its own separate long-running history of tension with the central government over cultural rights, economic development, and political representation. While the Kurdish mobilization described here has received the most international attention, largely because of the existing organizational infrastructure Kurdish opposition parties have built up over decades in exile, monitoring groups have also reported periodic unrest and security incidents in Iran's Balakh-majority southeastern provinces during the same broader period of instability. That doesn't mean Iran is facing a single, unified, multi-ethnic uprising coordinated across all of its minority populations simultaneously, since each of these movements has its own distinct history, leadership, and set of grievances that don't necessarily align neatly with each other. But it does mean that the specific strain currently playing out in Kurdish regions exists within a broader context of a multi-ethnic state, where several of its border regions have long-standing, largely unresolved tensions with the central government, any one of which could become more consequential if the regime's overall capacity to project authority continues to weaken under the combined weight of everything else happening right now. Now, let's turn to the second major thread in this story, because the state of Iran's nuclear program right now is genuinely one of the most consequential and least understood aspects of this entire conflict. Before the initial round of American and Israeli strikes back in June of 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency had a reasonably clear picture of Iran's nuclear stockpile, estimating that Tehran had accumulated somewhere around 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a level that sits uncomfortably close to the roughly 90% threshold generally considered weapons grade. That's genuinely alarming on its own terms, since a stockpile of that size, if further enriched, could theoretically provide enough material for several nuclear weapons, depending on the specific yield and design assumptions used. But here's the part of the story that doesn't get nearly enough attention. After those initial strikes, the IAEA withdrew its inspectors from Iran entirely, and it has not had meaningful verified access to Iran's declared enrichment facilities since. That means the international community's actual verified knowledge of what happened to that uranium stockpile essentially froze at the moment inspectors left, even as the broader war has continued escalating for months since then. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. Nobody outside of Iran's own government can currently say with real confidence whether that stockpile of highly enriched uranium was destroyed in the subsequent bombing campaigns, whether it was moved to a new, undisclosed location before the strikes happened, or whether it remains buried somewhere within the rubble of facilities like Fordow, Natanz, or Isfahan, potentially recoverable once reconstruction efforts progress far enough. The IAEA's own Director General has been remarkably candid about just how serious this gap in knowledge actually is, stating publicly that while there's no direct evidence Iran is actively building a nuclear weapon right now, the combination of its large stockpile of near-weapons-grade material and its refusal to grant inspectors full access represents a cause for serious concern. He's gone further, explicitly stating that until Iran cooperates in resolving these outstanding questions, the agency simply cannot provide any assurance that Iran's nuclear program remains exclusively peaceful, which is about as close as a technical, diplomatically cautious organization like the IAEA typically gets to openly flagging a genuine crisis. Adding another layer of uncertainty to this picture, Iran declared the existence of an entirely new underground enrichment facility at its Isfahan nuclear complex back in June of 2025. But as of the most recent reporting available, the IAEA still has not been able to inspect that site. And it doesn't know whether centrifuges have actually been installed there or whether it's operational in any capacity. That's an extraordinary gap in verification for a nuclear facility that Iran itself has formally acknowledged exists. Independent analysis of the strikes on Iran's declared facilities has also raised its own set of questions about how much verification uncertainty was actually resolved by the bombing campaigns themselves. Bombing can crater the entrances to a facility and destroy visible above-ground infrastructure. But that kind of damage doesn't automatically answer the much harder underlying question of exactly what happened to sensitive material that may have already been relocated before the strikes ever occurred. An ambiguity that several non-proliferation analysts have pointed out explicitly when discussing this exact situation. There's a broader pattern worth highlighting here too, because the timeline of how this current war actually began adds an important layer of context to the nuclear question specifically. Just one day before the United States and Israel launched their coordinated opening strike in February of 2026, Oman's foreign minister had publicly stated that the latest round of talks between the US and Iran in Geneva had made significant progress, with additional technical discussions scheduled to continue the following week in Vienna. The IAEA's own Director General has said he personally participated in the two most recent rounds of those talks to offer technical guidance. That timeline matters enormously because it suggests this war wasn't necessarily triggered by some sudden, newly discovered nuclear emergency requiring immediate military action. According to reporting, citing sources familiar with the planning, the operation had reportedly been coordinated with Washington for months in advance, with a launch date fixed weeks ahead of time. A detail that paints a very different picture than a war launched in urgent response to an imminent, freshly uncovered threat. None of that changes the underlying reality that Iran's nuclear program had genuinely advanced to a deeply concerning point by any objective measure, but it does complicate the simpler narrative sometimes presented that military action was the only available option once diplomacy had definitively and suddenly failed. There's a technical dimension to this uncertainty worth spelling out too, because the numbers involved illustrate exactly why this ambiguity is so consequential. Under the terms of the now-defunct nuclear agreement negotiated back in 2015, Iran had originally agreed to enrich uranium no higher than a level suitable for civilian power reactors, and to keep its stockpile capped well below 200 kilograms. By the time that agreement had fully collapsed and Iran had spent years steadily expanding its program in response, independent assessments placed Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 20% purity at levels that alone could theoretically provide feedstock for several nuclear weapons once further enriched. And its production capacity at Fordo specifically had been expanding toward tens of kilograms of highly enriched material every single month before the war began. That trajectory of steadily accumulating exactly the kind of material that sits closest to weapons-grade purity is precisely why the current inability to verify where that stockpile actually ended up carries so much weight, regardless of how much physical damage has already been done to the facilities themselves. Pulling these threads together, what you actually have right now on the nuclear front is a genuinely unresolved and deeply uncertain situation. Iran's declared enrichment capacity has absorbed serious physical damage across multiple facilities. Its ability to continue enrichment at anything resembling its pre-war pace has almost certainly been degraded substantially. But the central, most consequential question, where exactly that dangerous stockpile of near-weapons-grade uranium actually is right now, and whether Iran retains the underlying technical capability to weaponize it once circumstances allow, remains genuinely unanswered based on everything publicly available. That's not a comfortable place for international non-proliferation efforts to sit, and it's precisely the kind of unresolved uncertainty that tends to keep military planners, diplomats, and regional governments alike from feeling like this specific dimension of the crisis has actually been settled, regardless of how much physical damage has already been inflicted on Iran's known facilities. Now let's bring in the third major thread, the sheer scale of American military presence that's been building up around Iran since the start of this year. Because this piece of the puzzle helps explain why both the Kurdish and nuclear dimensions of this crisis are unfolding under such intense external pressure in the first place. Beginning in late January of 2026, the United States undertook what's been described as its largest military buildup anywhere in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, deploying a combination of air power, naval assets, and missile defense systems across the region in direct response to escalating tensions tied to Iran's nuclear program, the wave of internal Iranian protests already discussed, and a brutal government crackdown that resulted in thousands of demonstrator deaths. That's an enormous mobilization of military resources, reflecting a level of sustained American commitment to this specific theater that hasn't been matched in decades, and it's continued growing rather than shrinking as the broader war has dragged on through the months since. That buildup isn't just an abstract show of force sitting offshore either. It's translated directly into sustained combat operations, a naval blockade enforced against Iranian ports, and tens of thousands of American service members operating across bases throughout the wider region, all of it tied to an operational campaign that's inflicted real, measurable damage across broad swaths of Iran's military infrastructure. The economic dimension of this sustained pressure campaign deserves its own attention too, Because a naval blockade enforced over a period of months doesn't just disrupt individual shipments, it steadily starves a government of the revenue it needs to fund everything from its military operations to the basic social spending that helps maintain public order in the first place. Estimates of the financial toll from the ongoing blockade have run into hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue per day, an extraordinary drain on a government already managing the enormous costs of sustained warfare, reconstruction efforts at damaged military and nuclear facilities, and the security apparatus needed to respond to unrest in multiple regions simultaneously. That kind of compounding financial strain doesn't show up as dramatically in a single headline the way footage of strikes or protests does, but over a period of months, it steadily erodes a government's practical capacity to respond effectively to any of the other pressures described here. From paying and equipping the security forces needed to suppress Kurdish organizing to funding the technical expertise required to reconstitute damaged nuclear infrastructure. That level of sustained pressure, air campaigns hitting military targets night after night, a blockade squeezing Iran's oil revenue, and reconstruction efforts struggling to keep pace with repeated strikes, it creates exactly the kind of environment where internal fractures, like the Kurdish mobilization described earlier, become significantly more consequential than they might have been during a period of relative external calm. A government fighting a sustained, resource-draining war against a vastly more powerful external adversary has far less capacity to simultaneously manage a genuinely coordinated internal opposition movement, which is precisely why the timing of the Kurdish coalition's formation and its willingness to directly call on Iranian soldiers to defect carries so much more weight now than a similar statement might have carried during a period when the regime's security forces were fully available to concentrate on internal suppression rather than fighting a war on multiple fronts simultaneously. So does all of this, taken together, actually mean Iran is breaking apart as a functioning state? This is exactly the point in the analysis where it's worth applying some real caution, because predictions of the Islamic Republic's imminent collapse have a long and not particularly successful history. Observers have periodically forecast the regime's downfall going back decades, through previous waves of protest, through economic crises, through earlier periods of international isolation, and the government in Tehran has consistently proven more durable and more adept at managing internal dissent than those predictions anticipated. The regime retains extensive security and intelligence infrastructure, specifically built over decades to identify, monitor, and suppress exactly this kind of coordinated opposition activity. And it has shown a consistent willingness to use overwhelming, often lethal force against its own population when it judges that necessary to maintain control, as the reported thousands of deaths during the recent protest crackdown make painfully clear. It's worth remembering, too, that outside observers have a long track record of overestimating how quickly authoritarian governments actually collapse once serious cracks become visible. Even regimes facing multiple simultaneous crises, economic collapse, military defeat, and internal opposition all at once, have frequently proven far more resilient than contemporary analysis predicted, sometimes holding on for years longer than seemed plausible at the time, precisely because the machinery of state control, security services, patronage networks, and the sheer difficulty of coordinating a genuine alternative government tends to be underestimated by observers looking in from the outside during the most dramatic phase of a crisis. That historical pattern doesn't mean Iran's current combination of pressures won't eventually prove different, but it's a genuinely important caution against assuming that visible strain automatically translates into imminent collapse on any predictable timeline. At the same time, it would be equally mistaken to dismiss the current moment as simply more of the same familiar pattern, because several elements of what's happening right now genuinely are different from previous periods of unrest. The simultaneous combination of sustained external military pressure, a nuclear program in genuine unresolved crisis, and a newly unified, better coordinated Kurdish opposition movement willing to explicitly call for defections from within the regime's own security apparatus represents a convergence of pressures that hasn't quite existed in this specific combination before. Individually, Iran has weathered protests, weathered international pressure over its nuclear program, and weathered periodic unrest in its Kurdish regions. Managing all three simultaneously, while also fighting a sustained air and naval war against the United States, represents a substantially heavier burden on the regime's finite security, military, and administrative resources than any single one of those challenges would represent on its own. There's also a meaningful distinction worth drawing between the state genuinely breaking apart in some formal, structural sense, actual loss of territorial control, a fracturing of the military's chain of command, or a genuine secessionist movement gaining real ground, versus the regime simply becoming significantly weaker, more brittle, and less capable of projecting effective authority across its full territory while still technically remaining intact as a unified state. Based on everything currently visible, the situation looks much closer to the second scenario than the first. Iran's central government, as of now, still controls its capital, still commands its military and security forces in a formally unified chain of command, and still retains enough coercive capacity to carry out sustained retaliatory strikes against opposition targets both inside Iran and across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan. That's meaningfully different from an actual breakdown of state authority, even while acknowledging that the cumulative weight of everything happening right now, the war, the nuclear crisis, and the Kurdish mobilization together, is placing genuine, unprecedented strain on that authority in ways that didn't exist even a year ago. It's also worth thinking through what the different possible trajectories from here might actually look like, because the range of plausible outcomes is genuinely wide. On one end, continued military pressure combined with growing internal unrest could eventually reach a tipping point where enough of the security apparatus itself begins to fracture. Officers and units genuinely responding to calls like the one issued by the Kurdish coalition and declining to continue enforcing the government's authority, which could trigger a much faster unraveling than anyone currently expects. On the other end, the regime could successfully weather this specific combination of pressures the way it has weathered previous crises, using its security apparatus to reassert control over Kurdish areas once the broader war with the United States eventually winds down, absorbing the nuclear damage, and eventually reconstituting at least part of its program once international attention moves elsewhere, and continuing to govern in a weakened but fundamentally intact form. A middle scenario, arguably the most likely based on historical patterns, involves a prolonged period of exactly the kind of grinding instability currently playing out, sustained low-level conflict in Kurdish regions, continued ambiguity over the nuclear program, and an ongoing military standoff with the United States, without any single dramatic breaking point resolving the situation cleanly in either direction for a considerable period of time. What ties all three of these threads together, more than anything else, is the fact that each one independently reduces the regime's available bandwidth to fully address the other two. Resources spent striking Kurdish opposition targets in Iraq are resources not available for reconstructing damaged nuclear infrastructure. Attention and political capital spent managing the fallout from an unresolved nuclear crisis with the international community is attention not available for a comprehensive internal security response to Kurdish mobilization. And the sheer scale of the ongoing war with the United States, absorbing military assets, personnel, and economic resources on a massive scale, constrains the government's capacity to respond fully to either of the other two challenges. That interconnected strain, more than any single dramatic headline about uprising or nuclear ambiguity or troop deployments in isolation, is really the core reason this specific moment feels qualitatively different from previous periods of difficulty the Islamic Republic has faced and ultimately survived. What do you think happens from here? Do you think the combination of these three simultaneous pressures genuinely threatens the structural integrity of the Iranian state in a way previous crises haven't? Or do you think this settles into the same kind of prolonged, grinding instability the regime has weathered before without any decisive breaking point? Do you think Iraqi Kurdistan's leadership will be able to successfully avoid getting fully pulled into this conflict, given how much they clearly have to lose? Or does the scale of Iranian strikes against Kurdish territory eventually force a much deeper regional entanglement, regardless of what Erbil and Sulaymaniyah actually want? And what would that kind of wider regional spillover actually mean for the fragile stability the rest of Iraq has managed to build over the past several years? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered situation where informed perspectives from people following the details closely, genuinely add something valuable to the conversation. If this breakdown helped connect some dots between stories that often get covered separately, even though they're deeply intertwined, share it with someone who's been trying to make sense of where this entire situation is actually heading. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next update, and stay tuned, because with all three of these fronts still actively evolving week to week, the picture here is very likely to look meaningfully different again within just a few weeks, and possibly sooner than that.